I'd quite liked the idea of getting a TLR or Twin Lens Reflex camera for a while, but I didn't want to splash out on something expensive like a Rolleiflex. Then early last year I spotted this Yashica 635 at a second-hand market. It was a little more expensive than I would usually like, but it had enough accessories with it to make it worthwhile splashing out. At the time of purchase the camera was more or less working, but by the next day it had conked out. I'll talk about the repair process later in the video. Twin lens reflex cameras were a popular choice with photographers, and although not the first, the Rolleiflex became the one that many other manufacturers copied, or at least used as inspiration for their own designs. Among those manufacturers was Yashica, who were quite a big player in the TLR market, and you won't have to look too hard to find examples of their various models for sale these days. The 635 was manufactured from the late 1950s until the beginning of the 70s, my copy probably dating from around 1960. The big feature of the 635 was its ability to shoot both 6x6cm frames on 120 roll film and standard 35mm with the aid of an adapter, which we'll look at later in the video. So what is a twin lens reflex camera? Well, it has two lenses, the taking lens at the bottom and the viewing lens above that, both sharing the same focal length. The image from the viewing lens is reflected up to the viewfinder by a 45-degree mirror, which is where the reflex part of the name comes in. In the case of the Yashica and other higher-end TLRs, both lenses move as you adjust the focusing wheel, allowing you to focus accurately using the viewfinder. But there were also what are often referred to as pseudo-TLR cameras, like this Voigtlander Brilliant, where the viewing lens is a fixed focus lens, meaning that you have to use zone focusing or scale focusing to set the distance on the taking lens. There were, however, versions of the Brilliant that did focus both lenses, the two being connected by a gearing system. This gear system was also used on other cameras, such as the Helena A1. The lens on my 635 is the 80mm Yashica f3.5, and I believe there was also a Yashinon lens on some models. Round the lens is a bayonet, which can be used to attach things like a lens hood. That's only applicable to the taking lens, of course, because a bit of flare in the viewfinder is irrelevant. There were also accessories like filters and close-up lenses. I got this set of close-up lenses with the camera, which reduced the minimum focusing distance from the standard 1 metre down to around 440mm or thereabouts. I haven't used these to take any shots yet. Between the two lenses are the wheels to change the shutter speed on the right and the aperture on the left. The readings of both are displayed in a little window above the viewing lens. Shutter speeds range from 1/500th of a second down to 1 second, plus the usual bulb setting, and apertures range from f3.5 to f22. On the top left is the flash sync socket, and behind the aperture wheel is a lever to change between M for flash bulbs and X for electronic flash. Below the shutter speed wheel is the shutter cocking lever. Move this downwards to cock the shutter, and press the shutter release button to fire the shutter. There's no double exposure protection on this camera, so you have to be pretty methodical about your shooting routine. I opt for advancing the film as soon as I've taken a shot, and then only cocking the shutter just before I plan to take the next shot. The shutter button is very light, and I've taken several photos before I actually intended to, just by resting my finger on the button. In practice you'd soon get used to this, but I tend to swap cameras all the time, so it's caught me out a few times. Removing the ring around the shutter release button allows you to fit a cable release, of the kind that screws over the button rather than into the button. There was actually a little adapter in with this camera that can be screwed onto a standard cable release, converting it into the over button kind. The remaining control on the front is the self-timer, which is located on the bottom left of the shutter housing. Cock the shutter, move the self-timer round to roughly the 6 o'clock position, and press the shutter button. The self-timer will whir away quietly for around 8 to 10 seconds before the shutter fires. Thusly, on the top of the camera is the pleasantly large viewfinder, which pops open when you lift up the back edge. As with other waist-level viewfinders, the image is back to front, which takes a little bit of getting used to, but it's not that difficult. The frame lines in the centre are for when you're shooting 35mm film in the camera. There's a pop-up magnifier to help you get a good focus. This is raised by pressing the flap in the top cover, which is now at the front when the viewfinder is open. While the magnifier is up, you can push the flap fully down to access the sports viewfinder, which is simply a small hole at the back and a large hole at the front, which makes tracking fast-moving subjects a little easier, assuming you've already pre-focused at the correct distance. There's a button at the back that releases the front flap, and then the magnifier can be pushed back down before closing the viewfinder surround. On the right hand side is the focusing wheel, with distance markings on the wheel itself and depth of field markings on the case, should you wish to use hyperfocal or zone focusing rather than focusing via the ground glass. Above that is the frame counter, which auto resets when you load a new film. Behind that is the film advancing knob for 120 film. This will latch in place for each frame, then you press the button in the middle once you've taken the shot, which allows you to advance to the next frame. There's no connection between the film advance and the shutter, so you could theoretically keep advancing through the entire film without taking a single shot. There's an aide-memoire set into the knob to help you remember what speed film you have in the camera, but there's no exposure meter on the 635, so you can ignore this if desired. On the left-hand side of the camera is a cold shoe for mounting a flash, then the remainder of the controls are for the transport of 35mm film. The top knob advances the film by rotating it in the direction of the arrow. As with the 120 film, this knob will latch in place with every shot, and you then press the film release button, which allows you to advance to the next frame. There's a frame counter around the film advancing knob. In this case, you do have to manually set it to 0 once you've loaded a film. Between the advancing knob and the film release button is the rewind release button. Pull this out and rotate it slightly to disengage drive to the film. The film is then rewound using the 35mm rewind knob at the bottom. On the base of the camera is the tripod mount, and around that is the film door release, which rotates through 180 degrees anti-clockwise to release the film door. To load a roll of 120 film, firstly pull out the bottom knob on the left hand side of the camera to release the old film spool. Ease the spool out, starting at the now free end. The empty spool becomes the take-up spool for the next film, so pull out the top knob on the left hand side and insert the spool over the drive post on the right hand side before easing it down into position and letting go of the left hand knob. The spindle should now rotate easily when you turn the 120 film advancing knob on the right hand side. Incidentally, beneath the take-up spool that you've just installed is a spring-loaded knurled wheel. This is a friction drive against the paper backing of the film, allowing the camera to index the frames accurately. You can't simply measure how much you've rotated the advancing knob, because as the film winds onto the take-up spool, the diameter gets bigger, and therefore the frame spacing would increase considerably. But back to loading the film. You now take a fresh roll of film and remove the tape that will be keeping it tightly wound onto the spool. My demo roll is just the backing paper, so you'll have to imagine the tape. Keep the roll from unspooling by holding it between your fingers. Pull out the bottom knob on the left hand side of the camera. Insert the end of the roll over the fixed post on the right, easing the other end into position and then letting go of the knob, which will spring back in to form the left-hand post. The film is loaded with the emulsion side away from you. Now pull the leader up and over the top, inserting the pointed end into the slot on the take-up spool, all the time making sure that the film doesn't become too slack on the full reel. Keeping your fingers on the take-up spool, gently advance the film until you feel it grip onto the spool. Next, continue advancing the film until the start arrows line up with the two red arrows about halfway up the camera. Close the back of the camera and rotate the catch 180 degrees clockwise to secure the back. Then rotate the advancing knob clockwise. You'll see an arrow appear in the frame counter window. Keep rotating the knob until the number 1 appears and the knob locks. You're now advanced to frame 1 and ready to take your first photograph. Once you've taken shot 12, press the film release button in the centre of the advancing knob and wind the knob clockwise. This time the knob won't lock, so you can continue winding. A circle with a dot in the middle will appear in the counter window to indicate that you've finished the roll. Continue winding until you hear and feel the film has all transferred to the take-up spool. Open the back of the camera and, keeping your fingers on the roll, pull out the top knob on the left-hand side of the camera. The left-hand side of the roll will spring slightly towards you and you can pluck the spool out, making sure at least one finger is on the film backing, preventing it from unspooling. There will be another self-adhesive tab, like on this roll, to seal the roll up, ready to go to the lab for processing. Swapping to 35mm film involves a little bit more work. Pull out the 35mm rewind release button and rotate it slightly so it latches out. Grab the 35mm converter assembly. You'll notice that the bottom edge is spring-loaded. Slide the spring-loaded edge under the lip at the bottom of the 120 film window, then press the whole thing down against the spring-loaded section and the top edge should click into place. To remove it later, just pull down against the springs and the top edge should pop back out, thusly. Once that's in place, rotate the rewind release button until it drops back into place, thereby engaging the drive with the sprocket wheels. If you haven't done so already, remove the 120 film spool from the bottom of the camera and screw the threaded adapter over the right-hand post in the bottom film chamber. Then insert the driven support shaft into the end of the film canister. The one that came with my camera was broken, and rather than repairing it, I just 3D printed a replacement. Pull out the rewind knob and place the canister in the chamber, making sure that the drive engages with the slot in the support shaft. The 3D printed one isn't as good as the original, but it does work, eventually. Pull out the 35mm film advancing knob and install the 35mm take-up spool into the upper film chamber. You may need to rotate the advancing knob to get the drive shaft to engage, which in turn will involve pressing the film release button to unlock the advancing knob. You may need to rotate the take-up spool using the knurled section until the slot appears. Then pull the end of the film up and over the rollers and insert the end into the slot. Press the film release button and, making sure the end of the film stays in the slot and the sprocket holes engage with the drive sprockets, advance the film. Place the pressure plate over the film. The two prongs push down into the holes in the 35mm adapter, with the cutouts sitting over the sprocket wheels. Close the back and then turn the lock clockwise. There's quite a lot of exposed film when you load 35mm into the 635, so I reckon you need to press the film release button and advance the film 3 times to get past that point. Finally, set the frame counter to 0. Press the film release button one last time and advance the film again. You're now on frame 1 and ready to take a photograph. While we're looking at shooting 35mm film, if you want to use the sports viewfinder, there's a metal plate that fits over some prongs on the top cover, giving you an approximation of the frame that you'll actually shoot. When you've finished your roll of 35mm film, the procedure is very much like an SLR camera. Pull out the rewind release button and rotate it slightly so it stays out. Rotate the rewind knob in the direction of the arrow. You should feel the tension ease as the film is released from the take-up spool. Carry on winding a few more turns to ensure that the film is fully wound into the cassette. open the back of the camera and remove the film. Okay, that was all quite a big chunk of information, so I'll take a quick break now to look at some of the shots taken using the 635, and after that I'll talk a bit about the repairs I had to do on this camera. As I mentioned earlier, when I bought the 635 it worked, but by the next day the shutter had stuck solid. This isn't actually that unusual, because over time oil and grease within a lens or shutter assembly can degrade and spread, often contaminating the shutter blades and aperture blades. If the shutter or aperture hasn't been used for a while, it can appear to be working fine until the oil has spread out a little, at which point the blades stick solid, not budging until they're removed and cleaned again. The shutter on the Yashica is a Copal MXV, which is closely related to the Copal SV on my Canonet, so I was pretty familiar with the strip-down procedure. Getting to that point required the removal of the leatherette trim from the front of the camera, which on this occasion was brittle and already torn in several places from a previous service, so it came off in many pieces rather than a single piece. However, it was still just about good enough to reassemble as a patchwork quilt rather than using new leatherette, which would have stood out like a sore thumb. Once the leatherette was off, I could get to the screws securing the decorative surround and the front plate containing both lenses and the shutter. The plate sits on shims, and once disturbed, the distance to the film plane will need checking upon reassembly. With a few more bits removed, the shutter assembly could finally be freed from the rest of the camera. After that I could work my way into the shutter, cleaning and re-lubricating the self-timer and shutter timer modules along the way. Then the two halves of the shutter assembly could be separated, giving access to the shutter blades themselves. As you can probably tell from this photo, they were actually pretty dirty and covered in oil. The aperture blades were also removed at this point because there's little point in not cleaning them when I've got this far into the shutter assembly. Reassembly is just a reversal of the disassembly procedure, although getting the two halves of the shutter assembly back together is always a bit of a tricky process, which doesn't always go smoothly on the first attempt. All the optics were cleaned during the disassembly, and as with any camera that I've stripped to this extent, I checked the infinity and close focusing distance to confirm that they were still correct. Okay, that was all a bit of a marathon, so I'll just show a few more shots taken on the 635 before a quick summary. Using a TLR has its quirks, particularly the fact that the image in the viewfinder is reversed, but the sheer size of that image makes it easier to use than a 35mm SLR with a waist level viewfinder. You do have to remember on occasions that what you see isn't necessarily what you'll get in the final image. If, for instance, you like taking shots from a very low level, which of course is very easy to do when using a waist level viewfinder, you might end up with more of the ground in your shot than expected, due to the taking lens being about 1.5 inches closer to said ground than the viewing lens, thereby requiring you to raise the camera by the appropriate distance to achieve the shot you are aiming for. Overall, it's a really pleasant user experience and a well thought out camera. Not having to rely on zone focusing or an external rangefinder for setting the focus makes things much simpler than when using my folding cameras. Of all my vintage film cameras, the Yashica 635 is the one that draws the most attention when I'm out shooting with it, so if you want to be invisible, maybe don't shoot with one of these. The image quality from the Yashica lens is much better than I expected, and I've got no complaints about that at all. One thing that wasn't included with the camera was a lens cap, and I always like having a lens cap regardless of having a leather case or not. So I 3D printed this one. It's not at all pretty, but it protects the lens while I'm not using it, so it's good enough for the time being. And I think that probably more or less covers it. If you've enjoyed watching, please like the video and maybe even subscribe to the channel, not forgetting to click on the bell icon so you get notifications when future videos are released. That's it for now, so thanks for watching and I'll see you in a future video.